Hi folks, it's Ivan. Let's look at 15 ways to improve our technical documentation. The first is to try to create a conversation or a dialogue with the person reading it. And for me that means using phrasing that includes the person. So writing it so that I'm saying, if you're doing this, if you need to do that, rather than saying the user needs to do this, so on. Because I don't think anybody likes being referred to as the user. So using you type phrasing I think helps the person be more comfortable when reading it. But the other thing is that you don't want to be too kind of buddy-buddy, too overly friendly with the reader. And you certainly don't want to put any jokes into the documentation because it just sets the wrong tone and sometimes they just totally backfire. The second one is to remember when people read the user guides. And to a large extent, they're often kind of the last resort in the sense that people trying to figure out how something works. And if it doesn't, then they go to the online help or documentation. So bear in mind when you're writing stuff that it often is the last resort to someone, and because of that you need to shape it so they can find information very, very quickly. Like I said, I'm Ivan from Clarity, and let's look at some more examples of how to improve our tech talks. So when you're writing it, something you need to do is to kind of put things in context for the reader, so that if there are any kind of prerequisites, like things they need to install first or things they need to configure, say that up front, because the worst thing to do is to get them halfway through the documentation and then kind of say, oh, you should have done that, by the way, and you lose your credibility along the way. People get more frustrated then. If you're doing a lot of conceptual stuff, give them the bigger picture and then kind of drill down into smaller points. You want to give them a kind of enough depth and breadth so they can understand all the different moving parts in the software, but also understand at a kind of more detailed level how to configure the smaller little pieces. The table of contents should serve really as a master list of tasks, in the sense that the user should be able to scan through it. The table of contents should help the reader scan the list of tasks to find information faster, and if you write it in those terms, it'll benefit the reader, immensely. Though one suggestion is to try to limit yourself to 3 levels in the table of contents. I think if you go any more than that, it becomes overwhelming for the reader and it defeats the whole purpose. So when you are writing, especially with user documentation, to try to structure it in a kind of a task approach, in a sense that try to think of, one kind of problem they have and then how you would explain how to resolve that. Another approach to take is when you're writing about something is to develop hubs of information. And one way of looking at that is that the center of the hub is the conceptual information, and coming out of that like spokes out of a wheel, you'd have procedures and reference material. So that model of using the hub and spoke works very, very well. And as regards phrasing the procedures, if you use, they're called gurns, but if you use things that have an ing ending, to creating this, deleting this, printing this, you use it like that because it gives a sense of immediacy and they can understand what they need to do. So the document should flow naturally, structure it so that one concept flows into the next. And even though you'll break up your document into different modules, there should be a logical kind of transition from one section to the next. And if you do that, it improves the readability and it encourages the reader to go through the document. As regards modular stuff, what we mean here is that when you create the materials, try and create them in chunks so that you can reuse the content later on. In other words, you can reuse it for possibly other procedures or parts of procedures. So the whole concept of writing chunks and making your content modular will really stand to you in the long run. And like we said here, you can reuse it elsewhere too as well. And if you tag it accordingly, then you can configure it to go out to different devices and different platforms. When you're using labels, use them as efficiently as you can, or effectively as you can. Try to describe the actions that are occurring. Just don't say, for example, this is a screenshot of a certain window. Instead, kind of explain what's occurring on the window. And that gives the reader more kind of context. At the same time, keep it super short, scannable, because that's the way they're going to move through the document, at least at the first glance. Because remember, when they're reading the document for the first time, they're hunting for information. They're looking for the answer, and then when they find it, they slow down. So go back to the screenshots. Don't add screenshots just to pretty up or to add eye candy. They have to add value, and each one should stand on their own merit. If you're going to put them into procedures, show how they're doing something in the procedure rather than just a screenshot. So they always have to kind of justify their position in the documentation. Make sure to crop them. You don't need to show the whole window, but just the part where that's important, and highlight it in a nice way for the reader. Illustrations help balance the text to image ratio. So if something is very, very dense with text, it gets hard on the reader to digest everything. And images are a nice way to kind of act as a counterbalance to that. And using a combination of tables, charts, and diagrams all help. And again, one thing you're trying to do with images, I think, is try to explain the relationships between things, especially conceptual stuff. And I think if you use that, it kind of serves as a nice kind of introduction to material. Tables are nice to kind of help you compare data. So you can create a kind of visual hierarchy of information if you structure it correctly, and then it helps the reader interpret things. So you can kind of you can explain the whole concept in the introductory paragraphs, and then the table should help the reader scan through things and find the kind of information thereafter. An index really helps in the sense that if people are searching for stuff, they may search for, say, a particular keyword. I'll give you an example. I was writing software for a compliance company, and people would often search for very specific terms, and the terms actually weren't in the software itself, but people using it tended to use these terms because they were very close in the industry. So we put those into the index for the documentation, and it meant that when they find that in the index, then they would find where that term, it was through Sarbanes-Oxley, they'd find that then actually application itself. So using an index can be a nice smart way to help readers find stuff that should be there, that they assume is there, sorry, but you've kind of maybe possibly phrased or used different terms yourself. Some people get very, very frustrated with PDFs, and there's also issues to do with the fact that sometimes they don't render correctly, say on iPads and tablets. I know I've opened PDFs and they've crashed, Chrome and so on my iPad, and there's the issue, of course, of saving them. So I think there's a move towards writing stuff increasingly for the internet. So if you're using something like RoboHelp or Madcap or something like that, it allows you to create stuff both for PDF and for the web. One suggestion too is that if you are going to create web content, to use links in a kind of judicious way. Link to other topics, but don't overdo it, because if you have too many links on the page, the reader gets distracted. When you're sending it for the reviews, make sure that things adhere to the style guide, and that's a nice way to make sure there's consistency across your documentation. You may need to do multiple reviews, because if you go back to multiple edits, then more reviews come back. And when you do finish and get a final draft, go back and purge the drafts just to avoid data pollution. This is a little joke. So when you are testing stuff, make sure that you don't test your own documentation, someone else does it for you, and preferably the QA tests that against a live system, because you get snowblind when you're writing your own documentation, and that should expose errors, and you can correct that in the final draft. So I hope that helped. If you have a question along anything to do with technical documentation or writing, something like that, please leave it below the video and I'll get back to you for sure. Subscribe if you get a chance, and there's some other documentation guidelines, templates and so on over at clarity.com. So that's it, over and out. Speak to you soon. Bye bye.